Professor Park, President Park, Chairman Yoon, Vice Minister Kim, members of NKDB and also the Hans-Gregor Stiftung, first of all, may I congratulate you for organising such an impressive seminar, and also for the invaluable work that you do in breaking down the wall of secrecy that President Park referred to in his opening remarks. I'm particularly pleased, if I may, to see here friends and colleagues and people I've worked with in the past, but especially my friend James Kim and his wife Ayoon Lee, who was until recently a member of the National Assembly and who 4 years ago organised the meeting on human rights for me at the National Assembly, where Shin Dong-hok was able to speak with me. And as a result of that, he travelled to Britain and has spoken at our Parliament there too. In setting the scene and in speaking about how we moved from documentation to advocacy, let me begin by describing how I first became involved in human rights advocacy. I'll then secondly say something about what we can learn from the experience of the Cold War and the Helsinki Accords. And thirdly, something about North Korea's human rights abuses, and finally, what we then might be able to do about it. So these are the 4 points for discussion, but my main reasons for wanting to share this platform and this time with you today are to challenge, firstly, what I call quietism, and secondly, studied disinterest. And whether that's in faraway places, such as the United Kingdom, where there has been too little interest in the human rights questions in North Korea, or whether it's in the Republic of Korea as well. Challenging quietism and challenging studied disinterest. And I particularly support the call of President Park, which he made in his opening remarks, for new strategies, and to ensure, as he said, that the people of North Korea are not forgotten by the free peoples of the world. I first became involved in these questions when I was elected to the British House of Commons in 1979. And I began to see reports from the Keston Institute, which had been founded by Canon Michael Bordeaux, about the plight of persecuted Christians in the Soviet Union. In 1959, Michael had spent a year in Moscow as one of the first British exchange students to be permitted there. In Britain, he'd been asked to deliver a note to some Christians in Moscow. And in discovering them, he also discovered that there were just 41 Russian Orthodox churches still functioning out of 1,600 which had existed before the 1917 revolution. Michael later said, "No one wanted to believe it. Everyone wanted better relations with the Soviets. Yet the truth had to be told. Peace and friendship on everyone's lips in Moscow while churches were being closed, most outstanding bishops being brought to court on trumped-up charges, some of them martyred, executed for their faith." On his return from Russia, Michael established Keston College, and its role was one of documentation, and in many ways NKDB reminds me of Keston College during those days. Keston detailed highly respected reports which left no doubt about the scale and the intensity of the persecution, the factual authenticity and the reliability of the information which they produced, and their independence of government and propaganda outlets was the key to their effectiveness and their impact. For years, Western policymakers and diplomats had been urging quietism about human rights abuses in the USSR, believing that advocacy would make a bad situation worse. When Michael's reports were delivered to parliamentarians, they underlined what the suffering of Russians were experiencing, and that they wanted their stories to be told and interpreted and acted upon. Much the same might be said of the West's attitude towards North Korea, at least over the last few years. Keston College never saw its role as a campaign organisation. Its mandate was to collect and disseminate information. One of the cases which it highlighted was that of the Siberian Seven Pentecostals who'd taken refuge in the embassy, the American embassy in Moscow, and they remained there from 1978 until 1983. Their plight came to the notice of this young man, who's not so young now, but standing alongside me, but 30 years ago, a young Anglo-Indian called Danny Smith. And he was making his career in journalism, media and communications. Mentored by George Verwer of the Operation Mobilization and Peter Benenson, a Catholic convert who founded Amnesty International, Danny set about the creation of what we call the Jubilee Campaign. We met at the House of Commons, and sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with this. We met at the House of Commons, and I agreed to work with him in trying to secure the release of the Siberian Seven, whom you can see here. We began a systematic approach to enlist other MPs. We held vigils at the Soviet embassy and met with the Soviet ambassador. After the seven were freed, and as the case and information from Keston multiplied, in 1987 we launched the Jubilee Campaign. And in 1987, the Jubilee Campaign's inspiration was and remains Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which declares everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship and observance. So what might we learn from some of these experiences of the Cold War and the Helsinki Accords? After the freeing of the Siberian Seven, it became clear to me that many of the countries who had signed the Universal Declaration honoured this provision more in its breach than in its observance. In the 1980s, I travelled to the USSR and at the Kremlin raised the cases of some of the brave and inspirational Jewish refuseniks and Christian dissidents, whose families I clandestinely met in Moscow and Leningrad. And these included Vladimir and Marta Schlepak and Ina Begun, whose husband Joseph was incarcerated by the Soviets. In Leningrad, I met with Tanya Baranov, whose husband, Valery, a Christian rock musician, had been jailed by the state. She showed me some of the many letters that she'd received from people in the West, and which had given her encouragement and strength. Knowing that you're not alone is crucially important. I later accompanied and helped import the first legal printing press into the USSR, and Alexander Ogorodnikov, who spent many years in jail, was waiting to receive it at Moscow airport. Ogorodnikov was chairman of the Russian Orthodox Argentov Seminar. He came to a mature religious belief only after he'd been educated within the communist system, and he was therefore categorized by them as being mentally ill. Alexander spent most of the decade from 1976 behind bars, being released in 1987 by Gorbachev after a worldwide campaign. In the Ukraine, I met Evangel and Bishop Pavlo Vasilik. They had spent 17 years and 18 years, respectively, in Soviet prisons, mainly at Krem, the camp of death. I met the bishop's young chaplain, who had been sent to Chernobyl to clear radioactive waste as a punishment without any protective clothing, because he'd been caught celebrating the liturgies in the open. Their church, the Greek Catholic Church, had been illegal for 43 years, all of their churches suppressed by Stalin. Every day, people laid flowers at the sealed gates of their churches, and every day the communist authorities removed them. But they returned again the next day, fortified by their faith, but one day change would come. In Romania, I met the saintly Cardinal Todia, who'd spent 14 years in Ceausescu's prisons. He was deemed an enemy of the state, and I also campaigned for Georgi Kalciu, an Orthodox priest whose hands had been broken to prevent him making the sign of the cross, and who was down to 6 stone in weight. He'd been jailed for 10 years and had shared a prison with the remarkable pastor, evangelical Christian Richard Wurmbrand. Subsequently, I met Pastor, now Bishop Laszlo Turkish, who at Timișoara became the inspiration of the revolution in Romania. Today, he's a member of the European Parliament. In 2006, In 2006, I hosted the visit of the brave electrician who climbed over the fence of the shipyard at Gdansk in Poland. Came to my university in Liverpool John Moores. Lech Wałęsa would become president of Poland. He'd been a key member in the launch of the Solidarność, the Solidarity movement, Poland's first independent trades union, the catalyst for extraordinary and historic change. When in the summer of 1980 the great strike had erupted at Gdansk's Lenin shipyard, the immediate cause had been price rises. But although the Baltic workers had acted spontaneously, they had showed tactical sophistication enough to stay united and avoid being provoked into violence. They'd also grasped the central crucial truth. Peaceful moral protests were a form of resistance to which communist regimes had no answer. This realization had owed much to brainstorming by Poland's tiny democratic opposition in the 1970s and the crucial role of Poland's religious faith. But it had been taken further a year before by Pope John Paul II's historic 9-day pilgrimage in June 1979, 9 days that changed the world. When Solidarity was formed, it needed a source of moral authority. That was why it had turned to the church and why church symbols were used to express its aims and ideals. John Paul said of that period, Warsaw, Moscow, Budapest, Berlin, Prague, Sofia and Bucharest had become stages in a long pilgrimage towards liberty. It is admirable that in these events entire people spoke out, women, young people, men, overcoming fears. Their irrepressible thirst for liberty speeded up developments, made walls tumble and opened gates. And he said of the fall of communism, it fell as a consequence of its own mistakes and abuses. It proved to be a medicine more dangerous than the disease itself. It didn't bring about true social reform, yet it did become a powerful threat and challenge to the entire world. But it fell by itself because of its own inherent weakness. During that period, I was struck by the extraordinary courage of many of those involved, summed up by the memorable slogan, if not now, when, if not us, who. It took real courage to answer these questions in the affirmative, to believe you were the man or woman, and that this was the favoured time. Many paid a terrible price. Some, like Lech Wałęsa's countryman, Jerzy Popieski, the ultimate one, who lost his life. Popieski had been appointed by Cardinal Wyszynski as chaplain to the steelworkers in Warsaw and became a central spiritual advisor to many who followed Lech Wałęsa and his Solidarity movement. The price he paid was brutal murder. 400,000 Poles attended his funeral in 1984. Popieski had presided over many public masses during the rise of Solidarity. Consequently, he urged his listeners, Solidarity's numbers were approaching some 10 million people by their peak, to refuse to be goaded into violence. He said, don't struggle with violence. Violence is a sign of weakness. All those who cannot win through the heart try to conquer through violence. The most wonderful and durable struggles in history have been carried on by human thought. The most ignoble fights and most ephemeral successes are those of violence. An idea which needs rifles to survive dies of its own accord. An idea which is imposed by violence collapses under it. An idea capable of life wins without effort and is then followed by millions of people. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the stories of those who suffered the real heat of persecution for their political or religious beliefs became known. We called it a Cold War, but for men like Lech Wałęsa or Alexander Ogorodnikov, it wasn't a Cold War, but one in which they suffered in the furnaces. In the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn describes the corrupt and evil nature of the edifice which Stalin and his cohorts had constructed. He says of this society, quotes, there is only a wall, and its bricks are laid on a mortar of lies. There is no law. The same treacherous society, the same fog of injustice still hangs in our air, worse than the smoke of city chimneys. For half a century or more, the enormous state has towered over us, girded with hoops of steel. The hoops are still there. There is no law. As the following stories demonstrate, this is North Korea today. It is the same situation of oppression faced since Japanese occupation in 1910. It is what's been happening since North Korea has had a communist dictatorship. Let me first mention the story of Lee Kyung-soon, who was deported back to North Korea from China in 2004 after being arrested for crossing the border illegally. Her story is one of many which illustrates why human rights must be the central question in our dealings with the DPRK. Lee Kyung-soon was a young woman whose precise age remains unknown. She originated from Undok and crossed the border into North Korea, hoping to earn some money and to improve her life. During her time in China, she became pregnant. The central tenet of North Korean ideology, of course, is a belief in the purity of its bloodline, a racial ideology which holds in common with the blood-based nationalism of the Japanese colonial period. Becoming pregnant with a Chinese man or another foreigner is seen as a contamination. Women who were with child attempted to hide her pregnancy whilst she was serving her prison sentence. The police in the province, in the holding camp in North Hamgyong province, took her into custody in August 2004 after working long hours of forced labour on the construction of Seongmak Power Station and subsisting on paltry rations. She experienced a significant deterioration in her health. Sent by the supervisor to carry stones from the riverbed, Lee drowned. The summer monsoon had led to the river rising, and there was a strong current. Witnesses, one of whom later fled to South Korea and made a statement about those events in 2011, said that when fellow inmates recovered her corpse from the river and stripped her body, they discovered that Lee was wearing several layers of clothes and also a tightly wound kudzu rope around her stomach to hide her swelling belly. The witness said she was an Undok girl and she didn't even tell her fellow prisoners from the same area. It's because they are, without exception, aborted if they don't hide it. Following Lee's death, camp supervisors stripped clothes off of other female prisoners to establish whether others were also pregnant. The witnesses said that these measures were taken to ferret out pregnant women and to abort them. The international community, which for so long has appeared indifferent to the fate of women like Lee Kyung-soon, should remind itself of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's warning that silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Bonhoeffer perished at the hands of a regime which was responsible for racial cleansing, slave labour, brutal torture, and manifold abuses of human rights. It is difficult not to see parallels with a country where the United Nations and human rights organisations say that an estimated 200,000 people are trapped in a network of gulags and camps. The testimonies of survivors leave the world with no opportunity to plaintively assert that they did not know. Sobering accounts abound. Professor Dietrich Munterborn, the previous United Nations Special Rapporteur on North Korea, told me that he estimates that 400,000 people have died in North Korea's prison camps in the last 30 years. Munterborn, like his successor, Indonesia's former Attorney General, Marzuki Darusman, have all been refused access to North Korea. Professor Munterborn, who ended his term of office in 2010 and earlier in the year had appeared before my parliamentary committee at Westminster, has described North Korea's human rights record as, I quote, as abysmal due to the repressive nature of the power base at once cloistered, controlled and callous. The exploitation of ordinary people, he said, and I quote, has become the pernicious prerogative of the ruling elite. All 8 of Munterborn's reports to the UN detail an extraordinarily grave situation in which he says the abuses are both systematic and pervasive, and egregious and endemic. And he's concluded that, I quote again, it is incumbent upon the national authorities and the international community to address the impunity factor which has enabled such violations to exist and to persist for such a long time. Professor Munterborn has further recommended that the United Nations consider whether the issue of violations in the DPRK will be taken up at some stage at the pinnacle of the system within the totality of the United Nations framework. And he's called on the international community, and I quote, to mobilise the totality of the United Nations to promote and protect human rights in the country, support processes which concretise responsibility and accountability for human rights violations, and end impunity. In his final report, the outgoing Special Rapporteur concluded
The human rights situation in this country can be described as sui generis, that is, in its own category. Simply put, he said, there are many instances of human rights violations which are both harrowing and horrific. It is thus essential to mobilize more comprehensively the international system, especially the United Nations and all its affiliates, to act in a more concerted manner. Professor Munterborn believes that some 300,000 people have fled the country, many of whom have died, as they make the perilous journey into China across the Tumen River. Those who survive face the constant danger of repatriation. If returned to North Korea, it leads to their incarceration, and if they're caught, it leads to unspeakable violations of human rights. On the 23rd of September 2010, in the British newspaper The Times, they carried an editorial entitled Slave State, and they powerfully summed up the situation. The condition of the people of North Korea ranks amongst the greatest tragedies of the past century. The despotism that consigned them to that state is one of its greatest crimes. And in a message to people on the left of centre, the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, remarked, and I agree with what he said, the biggest scandal in progressive politics is that you do not have people with placards out on the street campaigning about North Korea. The people are kept in a form of slavery, 23 million of them, and no one protests. And no one protests. My own interest in North Korea began with an encounter at Westminster with an escapee. Technology is not quite catching up with me, I'm afraid. Yu Sang-jun, whom I've described as an Asian Raoul Wallenberg. You'll remember that Raoul Wallenberg was one of those who helped so many Jewish people escape from occupied Europe. At the request of CSW, Christian Solidarity Worldwide, I met Yu Sang-jun. He has bravely re-entered North Korea over the years and helped many other people to flee across the border. That also, I might add, led to his arrest in 2007, but on compassionate grounds, China allowed him to be repatriated to Seoul, knowing that in North Korea he would be executed. Since we met in 2003, I've chaired several open hearings at Westminster and elsewhere, where we've taken evidence and heard first-hand accounts from North Koreans who have escaped. I've travelled to North Korea 4 times, and most recently I met with the North Korean poet and human rights campaigner, Jang Jin-sung, who's standing here outside the House of Lords and also in the BBC World Service studio, and I'm very pleased that there is a representative of BBC World who's here today. Jang Jin-sung told me that too often geopolitical crises and security considerations have taken precedence over concern for human rights. I've raised the general issue and the issue of human rights in North Korea in Parliament many times, and with the North Korean authorities, and several reports which I've published, all of which are available on my website. But it was Yu's story in 2003 that I found harrowing and disturbing, and which forced me to feel I had to try and do something in my own small way. He told me how his wife and all but one of his children had been shot dead. He subsequently escaped across the border to China with his one remaining son, and that boy died en route as well. You encouraged me to read the prison memoirs of Sunok Lee, Eyes of the Tailless Animals, and through books like this and Barbara Demick's Nothing to Envy, we glimpse the sham judicial system. We see something of the show trials, the starvation, the forced labour, the degradation, humiliation, the rape of prisoners, and the brutality, corruption, paranoia, and humanity. These reports inspired the publication of the 142-page Havel-Bondevik-Weissel report, Failure to Protect, a call for the United Nations Security Council to act in North Korea, the point that Professor Munterborn was making in his outgoing report. The launch of that report I chaired at Westminster. It requires the United Nations to take seriously their declared doctrine, the responsibility to protect. It's hard not to be reminded when considering cases like these of life in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag archipelago, the chain of islands, the archipelago of labor camps and prison camps across the USSR, which were known only to those who were unfortunate enough to enter them. Solzhenitsyn remarked that someone that you have deprived of everything is no longer in your power. He's once again entirely free, which is perhaps why the evidence that is given to us by people like you and others who come and speak publicly in our parliaments and legislatures is so important. And it's undoubtedly the case that those who bravely risk so much in telling their stories to help others are doing what Solzhenitsyn did in helping to bring an end to the Gulag system. I've been particularly struck by the dignity, integrity and bearing of women and men who have suffered so much, none more so than by Shindon Hock. His story is movingly told by Blaine Harden in his book Escape from Camp 14, and I congratulate the BBC for broadcasting extracts of the book on BBC National Radio. I've now met Shin several times. It would be impossible not to be deeply affected by both his story and by his demeanour. Despite everything that's been done to him and his family, he still loves his country and wants the best for North Korea and its people. Shin is 30 and spent the first 23 years of his life in North Korea's political Camp 14, where he was born in 1982. Camp 14 is one of 5 sprawling prison camps in the mountains of North Korea, about 50 miles north of Pyongyang. No one born in Camp 14, or for that matter any other political prison camp in the absolute control zone that previously escaped from North Korea. These are places where the hard labour, the malnutrition, freezing conditions, minus 20 Celsius in winter, will often get you before the firing squad. When he was just 14 years old, his mother and brother were executed in front of him because they tried to escape. He was held for 7 months in solitary confinement. The torture he faced was unimaginably inhumane. With extraordinary dignity and lack of bitterness, he described at Westminster how he was hung upside down by his legs and hands from the ceiling. His torturers pierced his groin with a steel hook. He lost consciousness. Guards bound the hands and feet of the 13-year-old boy and roasted him over a fire. The burns still scar Shin's back. The memories have indelibly scarred his mind, and he remains haunted by the double life he was forced to lead and the lies he had to tell to survive. He said afterwards, me and my father couldn't mingle with other prisoners, and we had to work even harder than the rest, he said. Shin told my parliamentary committee that as a child, he witnessed fellow child prisoners being killed through accidents and beatings. He told me that children and parents were required to watch and report on one another. He was forced to work from the age of 10 or 11. He recalled to us, these were his words, a stabbing in the sole of my foot when I passed through the wire as he tried to escape. I almost fainted, but by instinct I pushed myself forward through the fence. I looked around to find the barbed wire behind me, but Park, who was his companion who was trying to leave too, was motionless, hanging over the wire fence. He died trying to get out. At that desperate moment I could afford little thought of my poor friend, and I was just overwhelmed by joy. He made it to Shanghai. He found a way over the wall of the South Korean consulate, and after 6 months there, he was allowed to travel to Seoul. Physically and emotionally, Shin, of course, was deeply scarred. 100,000 copies of his book have sold now in the United States, and in Denmark, his book is the biggest selling book. It would be good if in South Korea, his book was read by as many people who have read it overseas. Shin was joined at our parliamentary hearing by Ahn Myung-chol, aged 37, who worked as a prison guard at 4 political camps. He also met with David Cameron, who's now our Prime Minister and was then leader of the opposition. His story appears in They Are Crying for Help. We heard from Lee Young-kook, who was once part of the presidential bodyguard, who told us that from the very first day the guards with their rifles beat me. I was trampled on mercilessly until my legs became swollen, my eardrums were shattered, and my teeth were broken. They ordered me to stick out my shackled feet through a hole on the cell door, and then tortured them in almost every possible way. Not a single day passed without receiving some form of torture and agonizing experience. Try and move this on. We heard from Lee Sung-ae, who told parliamentarians about when she was jailed, all her fingernails were pulled out Her lower teeth were destroyed, and prison guards poured water mixed with chilies into her nose. Jung Guang-il described how he was subjected to pigeon torture, handcuffs, and tied behind his back in an excruciating position. He said he felt as though his bones were breaking through his chest. Kim Hae-suk was first jailed when she was age 13 because her grandfather had gone to South Korea. She spent 28 years in the prison camp, was forced to work in coal mines. Even as a child, she witnessed public executions. Kim, like Shin Yeon-hok, was incarcerated not because of any crime which they committed, it was simply guilt by association, becoming victims of North Korea's punishment of family members for up to 3 generations if a relative is said to have committed so-called crime. Particularly harrowing for me was the evidence given by 2 diminutive North Korean women, who, speaking through an interpreter, recounted their experiences in North Korean concentration camps. From time to time, their stories were interrupted as the women wept. John Yeon-ok, aged 40, had gone to China to raise money to feed her children. Caught in 1997 and again in 2001, she was sent to Northern Pyongan detention camp. I saw and experienced unimaginable things. We were made to pull the beards from the faces of elderly people. Prison guards treated them like animals. The women were forced to strip. A group of us was thrown just one blanket, and we were forced to pull it from one another as we tried to hide our shame. I felt like an animal, no better than a pig. I didn't want to live. They tortured the Christians the most. They were denied food and sleep. They were forced, she said, to stick out tongues, and iron was pushed into them. Despite all this, she harbours no hatred for her country and shows extraordinary fortitude and equanimity. The past, she said, is not important, but these terrible things are still happening in North Korea. These camps, she said, should be abolished forever. John Ai-shin was held in Camp 15. Conditions were so perilous that 1 in 10 of the 200 inmates was dead within the year. She described a regime comprising of hard labour, starvation and infectious diseases. Last year, Mrs. Kim Hae-suk, an artist, gave evidence to us and spoke of her 27 years in Yeodok prison camp, where she was taken aged 18. Around 50,000 people are incarcerated there. She showed her paintings depicting the suffering she'd experienced firsthand. Mrs. Kim used the pictures to explain what normal working days were like in Camp 18, from the manual labour undertaken to the scarcity of food provisions, to the regular public executions and cannibalism. She spoke about the death of her son in the camp. She then produced a map that she'd drawn from memory of the layout of the camp. Listening to her evidence, Rajiv Narayan of Amnesty International said that the numbers of incarcerated persons might be rising. Mr. Narayan added that Amnesty estimates that 2 of every 5 prisoners die in the camps. He showed a DVD entitled Hellholes, North Korea's Secret Prison Camps, and you can view that DVD on YouTube. These accounts have come from survivors, but many will never be able to tell their stories because in addition to those who've died of hunger and exhaustion in the camps, capital punishment has been used routinely, and the situation has not been getting any better. In one recent year, there were 52 executions, and since the failed currency reforms of 2009, these included the Minister of Railways, Kim Yong-sam, and the Vice Minister, Sonam Sin. All of this leaves the usual questions unanswered. To what extent North Korean citizens and officials, many of whom, it is true, live in stovepipes starved of information, really know about the human rights abuses that occur in their midst? How China, in violation of Article 16 of the 1995 China UNHCR Treaty on the Treatment of Refugees, can continue to use refumo to repatriate North Koreans to execution, forced abortion, enslavement or torture, and continue to refuse access to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to the border areas, and whether the diplomatic efforts of the United Kingdom, of the European Union, and individual parliamentarians, have they made any difference or borne any fruit? There are some who believe, and we heard from one who told us she thought that there were some signs of change. But during my own visits to North Korea, I must say that although I've been able to urge the authorities to address widespread concerns over public executions, torture, child labour, trafficking of women, and religious persecution, and I wouldn't have gone unless I'd been able to do that without agreement on both sides, candidly, I would not be able to say that I have seen any fundamental change. That is why we need a tsunami of like-minded parliamentarians to individually raise such concerns with the North Koreans. During my visits to North Korea with my colleague Baroness Cox, We left the North Koreans copies of the United Nations and Human Rights Watch reports. We urged them to open their prisons to international monitors and to invite the United Nations Special Rapporteur. Well, how did they respond? Their response has been to deny the existence of the camps. They say that international condemnations are politically motivated and fabricated. They say it's a response to their decision to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that the history of their country is one of struggle for human rights, that human rights for them means ending the exploitation which their system overthrew, and many other arguments with which you will be familiar. Well, in November 2011, 30 human rights organizations came together to dispute the North Korean response and pledged themselves to break the silence. The International Coalition to Stop Crimes Against Humanity in North Korea has brought together a remarkable alliance of actors involved in North Korean human rights issues, and it's one of the broadest global movements ever seen, and it is long overdue. It's often said that the North Korean regime has managed to exist behind a wall of secrecy, that it treats the international community with contempt by refusing to allow observers into the country. Well, if this is so, well, this shows why the Korean diaspora, like in former times the Jewish diaspora, must galvanize international opinion, and why gatherings like this are so important. First-hand accounts like those of Shin Jong-hok and others I've referred to are a clue to the massive evidence pointing to serial crimes against humanity. The experience of 1989 in the Soviet Union is one that should give us encouragement. Mikhail Gorbachev himself, the grandson of a Gulag survivor, ultimately consigned the Gulags to history. And one day, the Gulags of North Korea will be consigned to history as well. Thomas Jefferson believed that tyranny always gains a foothold when we shrink into studied silence. And Dr. Martin Luther King summed up the corrosive effect on our own character when we fail to speak out and when we fail to protest. He said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. So very quickly and fourthly, what more should we do? First, Koreans can feel greatly encouraged by all that's been achieved in the Republic of Korea, in this extraordinarily dynamic and diverse democracy. And we must work and pray that the Korean nation will achieve unity, peace and prosperity and dignity for all its citizens. Over the summer, I've been reading Kim Dae-jung's prison writings and his widow, Lee Hee-ho's My Love, My Country. In 1950, Kim describes how he was in Seoul when the North's troops captured the city, and how, as he was walking to a Catholic church, 3 North Korean soldiers and a lynch mob grabbed and dragged away a young man demanding his execution. This is what Kim Dae-jung said. He said, "This event helped me form anti-communist views. I felt the dangers of communism more directly than by reading 1,000 books about anti-communism." 30 years later, in 1980, Kim Dae-jung had been imprisoned again, and this time he was sentenced to death by South Korea's military dictatorship. During Kim's court appearances, bracketed by military policemen, he was handcuffed and forced to appear in a prisoner's uniform. Describing how he was held in an underground cell, how he was denied a lawyer and interrogated each day for 15 hours, he said, "The intention was to make me go insane. I could hear someone moaning in a room next to me. I was stripped naked and forced to wear worn-out military fatigues. I was threatened with torture." Lee Hee-ho described those years of imprisonment and house arrest and persecution, and she said that they were a truly Orwellian world of illegal brutality. And she said how supporters of democracy were deprived of any clothing. They were mercilessly pummeled with wooden bats, deprived of sleep, and had water poured into their nostrils, while hanging out upside down like so much beef hanging from hooks in the slaughterhouse. This makes very familiar reading to anyone considering the reports that I described to you a few moments ago by some of those who've been held in North Korea. She said, listening to these stories of horror, my body shuddered with indescribable indignation and sorrow. Yet Kim Dae-jung insisted that even those who used to oppress and those who used to take things by force must be freed from their sins and allowed to participate. Then politics will become art. he observed that the real purpose of politics is to guarantee the rights and life of the oppressed, and he reiterated his belief in democracy, social justice, economic development, national security, and the unification of our fatherland. During what Kim's the friend Cardinal Stephen Kim described as the long, dark tunnel of dictatorship, the decision of church and civil society leaders to resist dictatorship required great courage. In 1987, Cardinal Kim was ordered to hand over pro-democracy students taking refuge in the cathedral. He responded in trenchant terms: "If the police break into the cathedral, I will be at the very front. Behind me there will be reverends and nuns. After we're wrestled down, there will be students." It proved to be a turning point, and you know the story better than me. The government removed the police. The grandson of a man who died for his beliefs, as Cardinal Kim was, fully understood the gravity of the moment. Later recalling, "I thought that allowing police to enter the cathedral compound to take away students was the critical juncture that would decide whether Korea went along the path to democracy or extended military regimes." Now, what I conclude from these stories is that North Korea will have to go through the same process as South Korea, that North Korea needs a Helsinki process with a Korean face. The key ingredients will be engagement, encouragement, travel, communication, and persistence, the use of soft power. This approach is about healing history and creating a future. Throughout the Cold War, we understood the importance of preserving a strong and united front, and we declared a willingness to defend our values with a commitment to the Helsinki process, challenging ideologies and tyrannical regimes. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan stood together in supporting the Helsinki process throughout the whole of the Cold War. Simultaneously, while taking a strong stand on security, the West elevated discourse on human rights and fundamental freedoms. The final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, known as the Helsinki Final Act, Helsinki Accords or Helsinki Declaration, was the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, held in Helsinki in 1975. 35 states signed the declaration, which was an attempt to improve the relations between the Communist bloc and the West. Throughout the Cold War, though, alliances were formed between dissidents and religious leaders, Democrats and human rights activists. The Helsinki principle of critical engagement, dialogue, strong deliverance and strong deterrence of attempted in 2003 in the House of Lords, I said refugees. Since Tony Blair created diplomatic relations over 10 years ago now with the DPRK, we have had an embassy in North Korea, and you can see a picture here of our remarkable ambassador, Karen Wolstenholme, who is currently our fourth ambassador in North Korea. They have used the opportunity to raise human rights on every possible occasion. Throughout the Cold War, divergent ideologies were pitted against one another, but in defeating communist ideology, we combined wisdom with strength, self-restraint with a dogged patience, and worldwide alliances were formed between dissidents, religious leaders, Democrats, and human rights activists. And just as Keston College and Jubilee Campaign did in the former USSR, we who enjoy freedom should use it ceaselessly to shine a light on individual cases and situations. South Korean human rights groups have done a wonderful job in telling the stories of suffering and laying the truth bare. This needs to continue, and ever more links made with parliamentarians around the world, as happened during the Helsinki process. The European Union should provide resources to North Korean refugees and journalists to enable them to share their stories with a worldwide audience. For 60 years, the Korean Peninsula has longed for a lasting peace and a settlement based on justice. Peace, reconciliation, coexistence, mutual respect. Instead, people in North Korea have suffered division and threats. Whatever outside observers may think of their ideology or the system in North Korea, they should not confuse this with an unthinking hatred of North Korean people. They are a fine people who deserve much better. They deserve a liberalized economy, the implementation of the United Nations conventions to which the DPRK has already committed itself, the development of an independent judiciary, a just penal system, an open society, and freedom from fear. Above all, they deserve peace, and I believe this will only happen when we tenaciously pursue a robust and different strategy from the one that we've pursued hitherto. Thank you for your patience in this.